Hello, the topic of today's lecture are some challenges to Kant's moral theory. As you know, Kant's moral theory is the second of the major moral theories that we'll be taking a look at in this course, and just like with utilitarianism, the other one, there are some real challenges to it. There are some reasons to be a little uneasy with it and to doubt whether it may be the best of all moral theories, although it's still very good, and Kantians have reasonable replies to these challenges, just as utilitarians have some reasonable replies to some of the challenges that beset that moral view. So let's take a look at some of the greatest moral challenges in turn. I won't be talking about every single one of them that Schaefer-Landau lists, but I'll certainly be hitting the most significant ones. And so the first thing to take a look at is evaluating the universalizability formula that Kant provides us. Right. So remember, the principle of universalizability is that principle that says that you should only act in such a way as you could will that your maxim be a universal law, right? So remember, that's not imagine what would happen if everybody did that, because that's consequentialism, and Kant is not a consequentialist. It is not the golden rule, because that asks how you would feel about one particular thing or another. That's not what this is. This asks for whether a particular act can be made universal, whether it's logically possible. Now, the way that Kant put this, the way he phrased his formula, the way that he explained it, has a couple of little quirks, shall we say. And here are a couple of those. The first of those problems is that the formula, as stated by Kant, may permit some acts that seem impermissible, right? And so if you take a look at the text, right toward the beginning of the relevant chapter, Schaefer-Landau has this really great example of this fanatic lawn owner, right? And he sort of explains that. And so the idea is that you might have the way that the universalizability formula is presented by Kant seems to leave loopholes open for these kinds of things that we would pretty easily generally regard as immoral. So that's one problem. Another issue is that it's the reverse of the first, right? It may the universalizability formula, as Kant describes it, may prohibit some acts that seem perfectly innocent and morally permissible. My favorite example of this is collecting toy trains. Okay, so again, think of the definition of collecting toy trains, like what makes somebody a toy train collector, right? And so one plausible definition that I'll go ahead and propose is that a toy train collector is somebody who collects toy trains, who buys toy trains, but who does not sell them, right? They collect them. So again, I don't think there should be anything considered morally wrong about collecting toy trains, but you'll notice that kind of behavior, or I shall buy toy trains with no intent to sell them, is not a universalizable maxim, right? It's not logically possible for everybody to buy toy trains but nobody to sell them. So I hope you see the logical contradiction there. And so again, the way that Kant has stated his universalizability principle seems to allow some of these really sort of bizarre cases that are really sort of contrary to probably our strongest considered moral judgments. Now, of course, Kantians do have some reply here, right? Part of the reply has to be that Kant may have been a little clumsy in stating the principle, but that it still yet may point to something that's legitimately reasonable about morality. When we talked about the universalizability formula in the previous unit, one thing that was mentioned was that it really does sort of seem like most of your standard kinds of clearly immoral behavior stem from somebody making an exception for themselves on a backdrop of otherwise the good behavior of others and otherwise the behavior that they would generally expect. And so there's something about Kant's formula of universalizability that really does get at an important truth. It may well be that he was somewhat clumsy in stating it exactly right. It does seem to be a very difficult thing to state and get all of the cases correct. Of course, another response that Kantians might have is that you could monkey around a little bit with what really counts as a maxim, right? How specific can a maxim get, right? And that can probably avoid a lot of these troubles, perhaps not all of them. A second major family of objections, really, I would say this is the most substantial and significant and most common objection to non-consequentialist moral theories, like Kant's moral theory, and it is surrounds the idea of absolute moral duty. So the section of Schaefer-Landau you can find this in is the section called absolute moral duties. I would say that more often we call this objection something like the dire consequences objection to non-consequentialist moral theories. And in fact, the case is best stated with a kind of famous thought experiment that Schaefer-Landau refers to on page 179. The way it goes is this. So imagine that your friend comes to your house and says, "Hey, can I hide in your house? This other person's trying to kill me," right? And so you say, "Of course you can hide in my house. You're my dear friend," right? And then some moments later, to your door comes the person that your friend said was trying to kill them. Says, "Hey, is your friend in there? I want to kill him," right? And so now you have it. You're asked point blank. It seems like you've got to say something. I mean, just sort of standing there looking stuffed probably answers the question just as well as anything else would. And so yeah, I mean, so you don't really have an option here to dissemble. And so again, according to Kant, remember that lying is not universalizable. Lying also treats people like a means, right, by substituting your judgment for their judgment, right? You've got all these things where Kant's very clear that lying is very clearly immoral. Now, what do you do in this case, right? Now, I think most people, if when asked this case, say, "Oh, absolutely, you lie," right? And this is where consequentialists, point out something that really works in favor of their theory. Their theories are more flexible, right, in the sense that not every lie is exactly wrong. Again, what makes lying bad is what happens when you do it. That's a consequentialist way of arguing. Non-consequentialists don't have that option. They have to maintain that there are these kinds of absolute moral duties. And so this is certainly an issue for Kant's theory. And in fact, Kant addresses this exact case in the article on the supposed right to lie. And so we get to see, we'll talk a little bit about Kant's replies to this after we state the objection. Right. So I think the nature of the objection should seem pretty clear, right? It seems like we have a case here where it seems like the absolutely correct idea is to lie here. However, Kant's theory in particular says you can't lie, period, no matter what. And it seems like then that there's a problem. So note why this is called the dire consequences objection, because it's one of those things where I say, okay, here are the rules, right? You can't ever kill anybody, you can't ever lie, you can't ever steal, right? And that sounds all fine and good, but what if you're in some rare, weird situation where the consequences of not doing one of those things are really, really dire? Okay, which is, again, why we call this the dire consequences objection. And in this example, the consequences of telling the truth are that your friend perhaps gets murdered, right? I mean, that's certainly a dire consequence. And so consequentialists say, yeah, this means we were right all along, and that that the consequences really matter. Now, I should point out here that the dire consequences objection is the other side of the coin of the problem of justice that we saw with utilitarianism. Right now, if you thought it was a real problem that utilitarians had some situations where it was not only allowed but morally required to do some pretty nasty things, like murdering somebody or unjustly killing them, torturing them, raping them, right? If that happened to be the thing that ended up creating the best overall consequences, you'd have to do that. And if that sounded like a big problem to you, well, you're not alone. It is a big problem for the theory. This is the other side of that coin. If you decide, okay, the rules are no murders ever, no rapes ever, no torturing, no lying, no etc. So if you're going to be consistent that way, that you think that utilitarianism should be, well, then you're going to run into cases where the consequences are going to make you want to think otherwise. And so the problem of justice, I would say, is the most hugely substantial objection to consequentialist theories like utilitarianism. And on the other side of things, the dire consequences objection is a very strenuous objection to non-consequentialist moral theories. One might even call this sort of rights versus consequences kind of a dispute one of the central disputes in all of normative ethics. So let's take Kant's case for a minute, and Kant is going to try and convince you, right, that after all, you really shouldn't lie even in cases like the one described. First off, he points out that there's a difference between wronging somebody and harming somebody. Notice this isn't a distinction that utilitarians can make, right? Wrongs and harms are one and the same. Pains are simply bad no matter what causes them or why they're caused. They're just bad, right? And so you should do the thing that avoids the most pain, causes the most pleasure, and that's that. So this is not a distinction that a utilitarian is really capable of making. But the Kantian is capable of making it just fine, and Kant in fact does. So the idea is that to harm someone is to have some action of yours cause some pain or misfortune to someone else, right? That's what a harm is. But we generally only regard such a thing as wrong if the harm is intentional or due to some kind of negligence, right? So we tend to recognize a strong separation between wronging and harming somebody, and that's what Kant is appealing to here. So consider a couple of examples. Consider attempted murder, okay? As Sideshow Bob puts it, it's a crime that you didn't even commit, right? Attempted murder, as if anyone was ever awarded a Nobel Prize for attempted chemistry, right? Okay, so attempted murder is very seriously morally wrong. I think we can that one again seems fairly clear as a considered moral judgment, even when it does no harm. Right? I mean, somebody can attempt to murder you, and if you never even discover it, right, that it has done you no harm, and yet it's still, again, very seriously morally wrong to try to kill somebody, right? And so that's an example of a wrong that does no harm. Negligence, okay, that is, think of your favorite example, right? Negligence is to wrong somebody by putting them in danger of harm, even if that harm never occurs, right? So say you're fixing you're helping to do some work on your friend's car, and you sort of disconnect their brakes to sort of work on something, and then you get interrupted and you sort of forget to get back to it, but then you don't really warn your friend that their brakes aren't working, and so they go out and they use their car or whatever, and it turns out that they don't end up getting harmed or anything by their brakes not working, but they very well could have, right? So again, that's negligence, okay, and so that's wrong even if it doesn't result in any harm. Again, think of your favorite example of negligence, and I'm sure you can think of many. Consider a second kind of example. Imagine somebody who runs their business so well that their rival goes out of business, right? Well, that would do harm to somebody, right? It would certainly, cause them pain and misfortune to go out of business. That's not an easy thing for anybody. But notice it doesn't do wrong by anybody, right? This is one of those things where that's kind of the rule of that particular social activity, and so long as nothing is dishonest or underhanded, then there's no wronging going on, even if someone is harmed by the outcome. And so again, I think in common moral experience, we make a lot of these judgments that there's a difference between wronging and harming, and that's what Kant is going to appeal to here. So in Kant's case, he's going to say that you are not responsible for the harm that is done to your friend, but you would be responsible for any wrong that you do to anybody else, including your friend's assailant, right? And this is one of those things that in your standard sort of comic book movie, they don't seem. I wish somebody would be a Kantian in one of these movies where someone's like, hey, I've got this person here and I'm holding them hostage, and if you don't rob this bank for me, then I'm going to kill your family members, right? And so the idea is that, again, I wish at least somebody were a Kantian about this, and they'd say, look, I mean, whatever you do, that's on you, right? You're not going to make me feel responsible for what you're doing because I'm not responsible for what you are doing. I'm responsible for what I do. I'm not robbing a bank. It's wrong. I mean, I honestly, I really do wish. And just for the record, if I were held hostage by somebody and they demanded that some family member of mine do something immoral or illegal, or else they'll harm me, I would hope they would refuse. That doesn't necessarily make me a hard-boiled Kantian here, but I think I think there's at least some point to that. Anyway, I just sort of wish the movies would have it that way just once, just for the sheer novelty of it. All right, so here's the second point. The second point that Kant makes is something like this. He says that harm is done to the moral law generally. Okay, and part of the example he used, part of the reasoning that he uses is as follows. Most legal codes only regard as illegal a lie that does harm to the person who is lied to. Okay, so in general, lying it's immoral, but it's not generally illegal. It's only the lies that really do harm that the law cares about. Morality tends to be a lot more thoroughgoing than the law. Morality covers a much broader basis of things than the law can or should. And so even if a lie does not harm the person who is lied to, or even helps you or somebody else, it does damage to moral duty itself, right? So the phrase that Kant uses, a fairly dippy phrase, he says, it vitiates the very source of right. Okay, and if that's not super clear, remember this is Kant the poet coming through here. If you'll recall, Kant sort of wanted to be a poet when he was a younger man, even wrote some poetry that unfortunately survives to the present. But in a sense, like the best I can think to explain this is to use a kind of metaphor, a very common metaphor of it doing damage to the fabric of society, right? And it's hard, I think, to give this argument as much credit as it deserves. And the best I can do in trying to explain what Kant is up to here is by using a joke I heard a long time ago. Now, just be warned, it's not a very funny joke, but it does illustrate a kind of point that I think is relevant here. So here goes. The joke goes that you're driving, you get a ride from this friend of yours, and they driving along, and they come up to a red light and they just zip right through it, and you say, "Hey, whoa, man, that was a red light." And he says, "Oh yeah, don't worry about it. My brother drives like this." And you wonder, what's that got to do with things? And you keep going and, come up to the next intersection. There's a red light. The guy, boom, zips right through it, horns honking, tires screeching. And you're just like, man, you have got to stop running those red lights. He says, don't worry about it. My brother drives like this. And then you sort of shake your head and think, I'm never getting a ride from this guy again. And you come to the next intersection, light's green, thank goodness. And the guy stops and everybody else sort of piles up, stops, brakes screeching behind you. And you say, what are you doing? It's a green light. And he says, my brother might be going the other way. Okay. So just imagine how few people it would take who drove like that to completely destroy the entire system of orderly traffic that we have. I mean, it would take such a small number of people that drove that way and everything would be ruined, right? Everybody would just hesitate at every intersection because they just don't know whether it's one of these ridiculous, crazy people who drive like this guy and his brother, right? It's kind of nuts. Now think for a second, even keep track. If you got one of those little clickers or a counter on your phone or something, keep track of every sentence that you say in a given day and make a little mark just to yourself. Don't tell anybody what you're doing because they'll think you're very weird for doing this, but make a little mark for everything you said that was true and make a mark for every time you actually lied to somebody. And I think what you're going to find is that basically everybody tells the truth about basically everything, basically all the time. The kinds of situations where we know that people might benefit from lying about something, those are usually obvious to us. And so we're usually kind of on our guard. And about half the time somebody lies to you, they're lying to you, right? Or at least you have some reasonable suspicion. And so again, those situations tend to be few and far between. And in such circumstances as people are kind of know to be on their guard. So in a sense, again, if people really didn't take honesty seriously, it would take a very small number of people who just really had put no value in the truth to completely sort of ruin everything. And so I think that's the kind of idea that Kant is trying to get at here. A third point in favor of Kant's position that he supplies is that lying is an attempt to manipulate a situation in a way that telling the truth isn't, right? And it's at this point in the text that Kant talks about some legal codes that have things this way. And again, this is where he gets the idea. He's not making the argument here that because certain laws are a certain way, that that's the way morality must be. No, he's just saying, here's the law in some places, and he thinks they sort of have the right idea. So the idea is that if some lie of yours is causally responsible for some bad consequence, that you bear responsibility, in this case moral responsibility, for that consequence. And so even if you didn't intend bad consequences, your intent, that is your maxim, is bad, right? And so think of it this way. Imagine the hypothetical situation where, again, remember your friend comes to the door, decides to hide in your house, and then, shortly behind, comes this, the murderer or the intended murderer, somebody who wants to murder your friend, comes to your door and asks if your friend is hiding inside. Well, of course, here's what really happens. Say that your friend asks to hide in your house and goes into your house and starts, crawling out the back window because he knows, right, that you're an honest person, that you would never lie, that you take your morality very seriously. Maybe you're a very committed Kantian, and so he knows you're going to tell the truth, and so he's like just buying himself a little time. So what happens is you decide this one time only, because you just decide to give up on your Kantian moral principles and say, you know what, in this case I think a lie is morally justified. I'm going to go ahead and do it. So you lie to this person, you lie to the murderer, and you say, no, my friend is not in here. And of course they, knowing you to be a completely honest person who would never lie under any circumstances because you're such a committed Kantian, believes you and starts to say, well, he must have gone somewhere else. So immediately runs around the house, catches your friend coming out the back window, and then kills him. Now, because you have told a lie that led to your friend getting caught and murdered by the person chasing them, now it's your fault, at least partially, right? Because you tried to manipulate the situation, and your manipulation of the situation led to the death of your friend. You have some moral blood on your hands now, right? And that's this is, again, some legal codes really do work this way, that if you tell the truth and somebody does what they do with it, you're not responsible for what they do. But if you lie to somebody intending to manipulate their actions and they do something that has really awful consequences, that's partially your fault, right? You have some liability for that. Again, as Kant mentioned some of these legal codes, Kant argues that morality is essentially that way as well, right? That the lie is a kind of attempt to manipulate the situation in a way that telling the truth isn't. And so that even if your intent was to create good consequences, your maxim was bad, right? You lied, right? You did something that was, not universalizable. A fourth argument that Kant brings up is just the simple, idea that, again, we have to remind ourselves, if we're talking about a non-consequentialist theory of morality, he's going to say, look, the consequences don't matter to morality. The reason that you might say it might be okay to lie here might be if you think that good things will happen, or at least you could prevent bad things by doing it. And Kant is here to remind you that, he thinks that consequences are simply irrelevant. Like, what makes something right or wrong just isn't what happens when you do it. And so he says it this way. So like the fact that some action, that is telling the truth, also caused harm, right, but not wrong, to somebody is an accident of the case. That is, the particular consequences of each token act don't change the moral status of that action type. Even if some lies end up with good consequences, that doesn't make them right. Just like the fact that some lies end up causing bad consequences isn't what makes lying wrong in the first place. Right? You would have to accept that consequences were relevant to morality to accept the dire consequences objection. And so if the reason that it is right to tell the truth is not because it always benefits everyone, then the fact that it sometimes harms is not a reason not to tell the truth. So another way to put this is that Kant believes that actions should be free of what the philosopher Thomas Nagel called much later resultant moral luck. Okay. So imagine this, right? So imagine that you have two different, to try and explain the idea of moral luck, imagine an example like this one. Imagine you have two different people who drive while under the influence of alcohol, okay? And imagine one of them actually ends up, hitting and killing somebody with their car, and the other one manages to get home safely, okay? Is it the case that only one of them actually was doing something immoral? Right? Even so again, if you're gonna stick with this whole consequences matter, what matters is what happens when you do it. Well, look, if nothing bad happened when somebody drove drunk, well, then it was okay after all. right? But the one who actually did hit somebody, well, that means they did something wrong. And so the idea is that there are a lot of random features where sometimes you do a bad thing and it happens to cause decent consequences, or, in spite of your bad judgment, some good or even neutral consequences were the result. Sometimes even, the result of good judgment is that unfortunate things happen, just by bad luck. Kant's idea here, and I think it is a good one, is that morality simply shouldn't be subject to this kind of luck, as in luck in terms of the results. I think we want to say that the act itself of driving while drunk is the thing that's wrong. It's not only wrong because of what happens if you do it, it's simply wrong because it's, of the kind of act that it is. Right? Whether it actually results in any bad consequences, it's still negligent. Right? Almost maliciously negligent. Kant's fifth argument here is that one should know the moral status of an act at the same time as one acts. Right? Consequentialism, of course, makes this impossible. So in Kant's language, he puts it this way, a relevant quote from the text says, "The man who is asked whether or not he intends to speak truthfully in the statement that he is now to make, and who does not receive the very question with indignation as regards the suspicion thereby expressed that he might be a liar, but who instead asks permission to think first about possible exceptions, that man is already a liar in potentia. This is because he shows that he does not acknowledge truthfulness as in itself a duty, but reserves for himself exceptions from a rule which by its very nature does not admit of any exceptions, inasmuch as to admit of such would be self-contradictory." Right? So the idea is when if you come up to somebody and say, all right, tell me what you're going to do now and tell me the truth now, right? I mean, think about how that usually goes when someone says, okay, now be honest, right? I think in a lot of ways it's easy to be sort of offended, right, by that kind of an insinuation, right? He's like, what do you mean be honest, right? As if you're just going to assume I would lie, right? I mean, it's a sort of, it's an impingement on somebody's character often. And so, but Kant raises a good point here, right? When you say to somebody, when you ask them a question and say, okay, now I really want your honest answer, and then you ask them the question, and they say, well, let me think about, possible exceptions to whether or not I should lie. Let me think of the kinds of situations in which lying would be acceptable. If that's what they say, I think all of a sudden now the tables are turning. You say, what do you mean the exceptions for telling the truth, right? What do you mean you're just gonna, think about if this is one of those cases where telling the, where lying is better, right? Again, if we're going to have moral rules, they should be moral rules. And the idea is that, the consequentialist has in mind what they believe to be the action that will create the best overall consequences, but they never really know until the consequences actually happen. And that's something that, it's another issue that Kant and other non-consequentialists have with theories like utilitarianism. They say, really, morality should be the sort of thing that you're capable of determining at the time that that you perform your action. You should be able to know whether it's the kind of thing that's morally permissible or not without having to wait and see what happens when you do it. And finally, Kant gives us this kind of a question here, this argument here that says, for something to be a moral principle, it should not contain some element of conditionality, or else it isn't really a moral principle. And again, this comes out of the idea that Kant believes that morality is a categorical imperative, right? That he believes that moral rules are universal and absolute. This is just as he puts it. He says, all practical principles of right must contain rigorous truth. And the principles that are here called middle principles can contain only the closer determination of the application of these latter principles according to the rules of politics to cases that happen to occur. But such middle principles could never contain exceptions to the aforementioned principles of right. That is because such exceptions would destroy the universality on account of which they alone bear the name of principles. Right? Now, again, that's very characteristically Kantian in that it's way more unclear than it needed to be. But in a sense, especially those last couple of sentences, I think are clear enough. Right? It says if you Again, imagine you have, like imagine the pool rules, right? I mean, if you're at a swimming pool, very often there's a big board, and those rules are just written for everybody to see, right? Now imagine that all of the pool rules started listing all kinds of exceptions, right? One of my favorite pool rules, it seems like it was always on every pool rules, is no horseplay. And it's like, what even is that, right? But again, imagine it says no horseplay except for certain kinds of splashing, except for certain kinds of, sort of riding on people's shoulders. If the person on the bottom is much larger than the person who's riding on their shoulders, and, yada, yada, yada. So sort of listing all these exceptions to all these rules. And say, well, unless this or unless that or unless, then all of a sudden it starts to not really look too much like rules. Right, and more like we're just gonna put somebody the discretion for somebody to sort of yell at you if they think you shouldn't be doing whatever, and we're not going to worry about these rules because you can't really state them. So the idea is when you build in too many exceptions, it stops being a rule, and I think that's essentially what Kant is saying here about about the possibility of a bunch of exceptions to these basic moral principles. He's like, look, if they're principles, right? They only get to be principles if they don't have all of these kinds of exceptions. So one thing we should mention here is that that the previous case, right, the case where, again, your friend comes to your house, asks if they can hide, and this other person comes and asks if your friend is in your house. What may be going on in cases like this one is a case of a genuine conflict between duties, right? And this is something that hits Kant's theory specifically fairly hard, because it appears as if Kant did not really consider that duties could conflict with one another, or at least if he does consider it, it's not super clear what he thought to really do about that. So consider an example like this one. So imagine that you promised that you would meet someone for lunch. Then on your way to that lunch appointment, to keeping your promise, you stumble upon a shallow pond in which a child is drowning. If you help the child, you will certainly break your promise, because you're going to get all muddy. You're going to have to try and find this kid's parents. You'll probably have to file some kind of report, be a witness or whatever. But it seems very clear in a case like this that that duties really can conflict. Okay, so either you're going to be abandoning a duty of easy rescue in this case, or you're abandoning some moral duty to the child, just letting them drown so that you can make it to lunch on time, or you're going to have to break a promise, right? This promise that you made to have lunch with somebody. And I mean, I think it seems fairly clear, which of the two duties is probably more stringent in this case. But this is a case of a conflict of duties, and it's a kind of case that Kant doesn't anticipate very well. Kant certainly, again, it appears as if he didn't think that it was possible to have these kinds of conflicts of duties. And again, examples like this one make it look like there really is. And so that becomes something of a difficulty. It may be that you have a duty toward your friend, and you also have a duty toward this murderer. You have a duty to tell the truth, but you also have a duty to render assistance to somebody. And so maybe if this case is a case of conflicts of duties, of legitimate moral duties that you have, then it gets fairly hard, right, for Kant to explain just what you're supposed to do. Note also that the universalizability formula doesn't handle a case like this one well either. So again, the universalizability principle says, well, you can't make a promise, right? If you're, in fact, remember one of Kant's examples was an example of somebody who borrowed money without any intention to repay it. I mean, if that's not an example of breaking a kind of promise, I don't know what is. And also one of his other examples is refusing to render assistance to somebody, like not doing them any harm, just just refusing to assist them. And he thinks that's not universalizable either. He thinks you have to be able to universalize, doing good when able. And so again, in the case of this drowning child, again, if that's not a case of, rendering assistance when needed, I don't know what is. And so again, it looks like, Kant is saying you have to do both of these things. And if you're in a situation where you clearly can't do them both, we have a real and legitimate conflict of duties. And Kant himself does not necessarily supply clear direction about what to do about this. So another kind of objection that is very often raised. So I mean, aside from, we're going to sort of move on from the previous objection, right, to Kant's theory. and take a look at a different one. And this is one that is, again, a very common objection to Kant's moral theory. And it goes this way. Okay, the idea is that if reason is supposed to be the thing that provides the moral law, right, that is, moral law applies to all rational beings, then anybody who does not have the full use of reason would not be part of the moral community. And so one of the things that is a problem for Kant are things like small children, animals, right? Those with serious mental disabilities. And it seems right to say that they are part of the moral community, right? At least in some way. But Kant's view does appear to exclude them, right? Because again, of this reliance that he has on the exercise of reason. Now, Kant's actual replies to these charges, because this was a known issue for Kant, and the way that Kant replied to this, especially with the case of things like, small children and animals, is honestly not very good. So one of the things that Kant said is like, look, somebody who treats children badly, who treats animals badly, just sort of makes a brute out of themselves, right? They sort of, make of themselves a brutish person. But honestly, if there's not something wrong with doing those things, then what about them would make a person brutish? And so it sort of gets the cart before the horse, doesn't really answer the objection. So here is how Kant probably should have answered an objection of this kind. So, well, that's just exactly what I described there. So, again, his original response is sort of lame, again, because if there wasn't anything morally wrong with mistreating or little children, there would be no reason why such behavior would create a bad habit or a bad precedent or anything like that. Okay. Okay. So here's the reply that Kant should have made. Okay. He really should have made explicit an assumption that most people generally make, that there is a difference between a moral subject and a moral agent, right? So when you're talking about a member of the moral community, that's going to include both of those things, but those things are not the same thing. So a moral subject is something that can be the subject of a moral act, right? That is, that it can be morally wronged. So, for example, if you, kick a dog or something like that, you are doing wrong to the dog, right? You are causing it pain. That's the idea, is that, the dog is a moral subject. Okay, it can be wronged, right? So same thing with small children, people with very serious mental disabilities. They seem to be the sort of things you can do wrong to those, those are moral subjects. A moral agent is something that can themselves do right or wrong because they appreciate the difference, right? In general, human beings, right, count as both moral subjects and moral agents, right? Because we are capable in general of understanding, right, what is right or wrong, appreciating the difference, right? And we are also, we can be wronged by somebody else, right? So your general standard adult human being is both a moral subject and a moral agent. Animals tend to be moral subjects, but not moral agents, right? So we think that you can do wrong to a dog, but we don't hold the dog morally responsible for things. Like when we say good dog or bad dog, we don't mean morally good dog, right? We don't we don't hold them responsible for their actions in a moral sense. That's a difference there. Of course, rocks are neither moral subjects nor moral agents. And if you're a very logical person and are thinking, yes, but what about that fourth possible category, that of a moral agent that is not a moral subject? Well, that's a tough one, right? And it's hard to imagine a category like that really existing. But I can sort of imagine it. In a sense, it's what you might call a slave morality, right? Where you might say in a particularly bad condition of slavery, somebody may be held responsible for the actions that they take, and yet, be considered to be, not actually moral subjects, as in not the sort of things you could do wrong to. So you can't wrong your slave, but they sure can wrong you, right? And so, I mean, that just the very condition of slavery seems so obviously immoral that I don't think this could be, counted as a real category. But that's the closest I can get to an example of some where somebody would be treated as a moral subject, a moral agent, but not a moral subject. And so, I think you see the trouble. In any case, Kant can use this distinction to try and make a pretty reasonable point here. So Kant's theory explains that the use of reason is what makes something a moral, makes something a moral agent, and that actually seems right. Right, that what makes something a moral agent is something like the ability to reason, the ability to think about morality, the ability to appreciate the difference between right and wrong. However, his assumption that reason is also what makes something a moral subject is pretty doubtful, right? And I think you would need some different story to explain why some things that are non-rational beings, like animals, young children, and people with serious mental disabilities, are are still yet moral subjects. But before you go and think that this is a real sort of slam dunk for consequentialists who, if you'll remember, have a really great story about the scope of their moral community. They say, look, all we have to do is consider whether something feels pain or not, and of course it's part of the moral community. But again, that's a little ambiguous between moral subjects and moral agents. Utilitarianism does indeed have a very good explanation for what makes something a moral subject, right? They point out that it feels pain or feels pleasure, and if that's the case, it counts, right? Those pains and pleasures count. But notice the utilitarian doesn't really have a very convincing story about what makes something a moral agent. Right? They can't say, oh, well, it's somebody who understands the consequences of their actions, because again, intent doesn't matter at all for a utilitarian, right? Somebody who didn't understand what they were doing or thought they were doing something really great but ended up doing something really terrible still did the wrong thing, right? And so what people understand, what people's mental states are, those aren't consequences. Remember, the utilitarian only looks at the consequences to determine the moral worth of an act. And so again, the utilitarian is this really great story about what makes a moral subject, but really no story about what makes a moral agent, while Kant here has this really great idea of what makes a moral agent and kind of no story about what makes a moral subject. Right, so I think that both sides could acknowledge their sort of what the things they do sort of well on this question and the things that they do very poorly on this question. And so I think that's something to remember if using this as a reason to object to the Kantian moral theory, is that there's a similar objection on the other side for especially non-consequentialist, for utilitarians, I should say. And so that's a lot of information. Again, I would encourage you to look at little bits of this and really sort of follow along with the text. But in general, I want you to think of three large-scale issues that Kantian moral theory faces, and some of the ways that Kantians tend to reply to these things. So in terms of the dire consequences objection, Kant supplies a great many reasons why he thinks his theory stands up just fine, even in cases where doing the right thing, doing one's moral duty, ends up with sometimes even very bad consequences, like in the case of your friend and this this person wants to murder your friend. Keep in mind that the Kantian moral theory doesn't seem to have a really great way of handling conflicts of duties. And so what that means is that if you want to be a non-consequentialist, that's a thing that you've got to do. You've got to come up with some way of handling conflicts of duties, but because Kant himself doesn't really seem to provide this particularly well. Again, that doesn't mean that everything Kant said must be thrown out the window or something like that, but it's an issue. It's something to fix. And finally, you might object that Kant seems to have too narrow a moral community. And if you liked how wide the moral community is in the utilitarian theory, this looks pretty good, until, again, you make a distinction between moral subjects and moral agents, and you realize that, that both major theories that we've seen so far have an interesting problem explaining one kind of the moral community, whether it be moral agents or moral subjects.